Did something predispose you to being more nature oriented or like needing to see solutions, or something that is why maybe permaculture found fertile ground in you?
Oh yeah. All I'd ever heard before that was like to be good for the environment, you just had to do less. You had to like not destroy things and not whatever. And I loved the idea of a opportunity for positive interaction that would make a difference. And I really liked the idea of not just sort of like studying ecosystems or not touching them, but of actually like designing them and evolving with them and cooperating with them to do things. That was really that really spoke to me. I was just really interested in the subject matter, and I needed a way to organize the information and communicate the information. The example I like to give is that I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and there were these heavy duty rule books that had like long tables of different kinds of monsters and things like that. And I sort of think of some of my work as sort of like the Dungeon Master's Guide to Permaculture or something, being like tomes with extensive lists of species and stuff. Dave Jackie was coming to give a lecture on permaculture, and that's where I learned about the designer's manual. And I borrowed $70 from somebody to buy a copy. Bought a copy from Dave, and then we decided to do a weekend edible forest garden workshop. And at that workshop, somebody came from Chelsea Green and said, hey, we've been thinking we need a book on this. What do you guys think about writing that? Both Dave and I have a bit of a tendency to dive in deep and go down rabbit holes and prefer more detailed examinations of things than is maybe always best for us to do. But in the case of that book, it took a long time and it was hard and economically challenging while we were working on it. But I don't regret that we went to the level of detail we did, and I think we did a service to that world by trying to really go at it. There's things I wish we had done differently, things we didn't explore that I would have liked to explore, but I'm not disappointed in the product. I mean, it's a great book. I use it all the time.
Yes.
I don't remember all that stuff. One regret I have with the book being so massive and long and expensive is that it makes people feel like you need a PhD in order to do this. And actually, it's just gardening. Guidelines for Perennial Polyculture Design is the 2-page boiled down bullet point. Here's what you actually do. I think the editor was like, you guys have a problem. Yeah. You can fix that in these following ways. And we thought splitting in two is great, and no regrets. The scope of edible forest gardens was broad to begin with and kept expanding. So the idea for perennial vegetables was, let's make a really narrow scope. It's like a design constraint.
Yes.
This is a book about perennial vegetables. It tells you what they are, how to use them, and describes them. Anything else that does not fit in that is a different book.
That's right.
So I was able to do it a lot faster as a result. And I've really tried since then to create these very defined scopes to avoid this like scope creep or mission creep that is so easy for things to expand and expand and expand. I have always felt like creating constraints is one of the most important design tools that we have. The possibilities are endless, and that is not our friend.
Yes.
If you clarify your goals and understand the site well, or the market in case of a book or whatever, or the subject matter in case of a book, the more you create those constraints, the less like magical inspired creativity is required, and the more it's just like the road is laid out before you pretty clearly. One of the things I did in the interim there is I wrote a peer-reviewed science paper where we identified over 600 cultivated perennial vegetable species from around the world.
Wow.
So there are so many species of perennial vegetables grown, not just like wild perennials we could grow, but actually grown as vegetables. None of them are grown on that big a scale, but it's like a huge percentage of the world's vegetable crop species are perennial vegetables, just not a huge percentage of the, acreage or whatever in quite the same way. So what I came back to is when I wrote perennial vegetables, it was a little bit like this is kind of a novelty thing, or like, hey, here's a cool, crazy idea. And what I think now is this is a thing that was independently invented hundreds and hundreds of times around the world in all different places because it's just a good idea. And then I looked at their nutrition also, and it turns out that a great many perennial vegetables are really high in the nutrients humanity is most lacking. And the trees with edible leaves are the most nutritious category of all vegetables, period. I liked the inspiration of the tropical vegetables to sort of show us what would be possible if we did some breeding work.
Yeah.
They sort of set the bar. And in fact, most of my career has been looking at tropical agroforestry and tropical perennial crops and saying, how do we do that here? You know, how do we do what Mollison and Holmgren were writing about? How do we do what tropical agroforesters have done for 10,000 years in their backyard food forests? What does it look like to translate that here? I learned about all these trees with edible leaves from the tropics, and then I thought, okay, well, what are our candidates? Like
That's
that's
right.
why I tried saltbush, which was amazing. This tree purslane they call it, and I had linden leaves and stuff, and I tried tuna sinensis, which tastes like chicken soup, and
Mm.
so I just got hooked on more and more of these as I went. Also because they're easy. I also like the seasonality of them. I learned that herbaceous perennials, on paper, you don't know, but when you sit down and grow a bunch of them, the herbaceous perennials are mostly spring, and some of them come back in fall, but
Mm.
they're mostly dormant in the summer. So that's either a time for annual vegetables or a time for those trees with edible leaves to kick in.
That's
They'll
right.
produce from like, late May here in Massachusetts, late May through like the end of September. By then, your fall perennials are coming back on. Then you get your winter greenhouse vegetables going, and you have a year round supply of green leaves to eat, which you should really eat some every day. A lot of people have told me that was the way they were able to get into this kind of stuff, was like they needed this story as a hook. They don't want to sit down and read a textbook. They want
Go figure.
so it helped, I think, it was a different mode, and it helped reach a different audience. And we thought everybody in our neighborhood would plant an edible forest garden and no one else would care. No one in our neighborhood planted an edible forest garden, but they wanted us to write a book, and they reviewed the book in the New York Times, and people came from all over the world to see the garden.
Crazy.
So not what we planned at all, but it worked out very nicely for us. Thousands and thousands of people came through there over the years. The whole thing is 1/10 of an acre, but that includes the house. And the main garden was the backyard, which was 45 feet by 90 feet.
So very small.
Pretty small, and with a lot of shade as well. And we grew around, it averaged around 170, 200 species at any given time, but we trialed another 100 or 200 that either failed to grow or were terrible weeds or tasted bad or something. The final count was about 70 perennials with edible leaves, about 50 different species and cultivars of fruit. And by the final years, we had this insulated bioshelter that totally no energy used at all, that we were able to grow citrus and stuff in with no heat of any kind, and tree collards and stuff. And we were able to go, the last 2 years I was there was never a day without fruit.
Jeez.
Because the last fruit, the persimmons go through about Thanksgiving here, and then we would have a few other fruits like perennial ground cherries outside till about Christmas. The citrus would start around mid-December, and the citrus just went, like the Kalamata, just went actually all year round, both of those years.
So good.
I'm anxious to get to that point again here. Winters
I
are really
bet.
sad without fresh citrus once you're used to that. It feels very uncivilized to go to the store. And it was also sort of about looking at a bigger scale. That book was also about, okay, the garden is cool. I feel like I've learned how to do this in a garden. What does it look like on a farm?
Yep.
What are people doing around the world? What's the sort of like pattern language of types of farming? I think the saying is, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win.
Yeah.
So I think we've moved from ignore to laugh at you, which is great. That's a good.
That is great.
That's a good. That's sort of
moving in the right direction.
It's the sleep, creep, leap of movement building. I wrote an article recently with a bunch of kind of like leading lights in perennial ag in the States, that was driven by the Harvard Law Center of all people. Oh. And when Harvard Law is excited about perennial agriculture, you've kind of like come somewhere. So we wrote a set of policy recommendations for perennializing agriculture, which includes things like taking some fields that are, not good choices for annual cropping and converting them to pasture. Or growing strips of perennial grasses on contour within your crop fields, all the way on to full tree crops. And the way that I've read about this being done in like tropical context is often you start with the edges of the farm, put in a windbreak or a tree, border planting of trees or a riparian buffer of trees. And you only gradually work your way into planting trees in the middle of the field. That's like the last thing you do. And compared to even 10 years ago, it's another world. I credit organizations like Interlaced Commons and the Savannah Institute, academic work like the University of Missouri has done incredible agroforestry development work for decades. It feels like, 20, 30 years ago, all the new cool farmers wanted to start a CSA, people who were starting. And then they all wanted to start a grass-fed livestock operation, and now they all want to start an agroforestry operation.
Excellent.
And that tells me we're on the right track. These practices are now funded through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Not in every state, but there's at least a practice that can be turned on to pay people money to adopt. So we've come a long way in the right direction compared to 20 years ago. People did laugh at you, or they just didn't even understand what you meant.
Right.
And I think it's a very exciting time to see that kind of change in one's adult lifetime. And we basically made a map of the whole world and all of its land and sort of allocated it up. Really, that was if my first books were about gardening and then carbon farming was about the farm scale, Drawdown was about the planetary scale.
Which is so great. I love
which
that.
was really fun to do. And actually, we wrote an article, Kevin Bayek and I wrote an article in the UK Permaculture magazine about that process and how it really was, in a way, a permaculture design for the planet. And I wrote the book I was able to get money to write it, so I put it out as a free downloadable PDF, which is now in 4 languages and about to be in a 5th. So I've been working with volunteers to translate it in different languages, and it's already been downloaded at least 50,000 times.
Wow.
So it's really got legs. It's really moving. So I did an inventory of all of the trees without a beliefs that I could figure out that were cultivated as vegetables around the world. Not the promising other ones you could grow, which there's lots of. Just the ones I found 102.
Wow.
And mostly from the tropics, of course, but quite a few from temperate East Asia, many that will grow just fine in places like Michigan and Massachusetts. And then there's only like 3 or 4 basic patterns of growing them. And there's only 3 or 4 basic patterns of pruning them.
Cool.
So even though it's a incredibly diverse planet, mostly the way and you're using different species, the way you grow them is mostly the same everywhere. You pretty much pollard them and prune them back hard every year and let them grow. So you get a longer season of harvest that way, a much longer season of harvest. You can actually reach them without risking your life. And you can grow them on their own. You can grow them in a little block. You can grow them in various kinds of agroforestry systems. It was really fun to write this thing that had this kind of universality to it. Not that there aren't, again, a few exceptions here and there, but mostly we grow these things. You grow moringa the same way as you grow edible leaf mulberry, the same way you grow Chinese tune, the same way you grow nopali cactus. Even it's pretty much wherever you go, it's the same kind of pattern. Well, the edible leaf mulberry is definitely one of the very best. It's super nutritious. It's really easy to grow. Chinese tune, I think, is a must-have.
Toon, is that right?
Toon, yeah. It's Tuna sinensis is the Latin name. It looks like an ailanthus or a sumac or a walnut. It has that kind of leaf pattern, and it tastes like chicken soup.
Crazy.
And in my analysis of the world's vegetables and their nutrition, where we compared 300 different species, it was the second most nutritious in the world, and the only one of those that can be grown in cold. And number 1 only grows in the tropics, so it's like off the charts nutritious.
Wow.
And it's just grown with pollarding or coppicing. So it's super easy to grow. My favorite is one called Fruitless, which they grow. It's a male cultivar, and they grow it a lot as an ornamental out west. It grows really well, has huge leaves, they taste great. Probably mulberry, linden, and tune would be the three that should be in every permaculture garden.
I'd rather fail at permaculture than succeed at almost anything else. It gave me a direction. It gave me an ethic. It gave me the guidelines in which to direct my life efforts, to give purpose to what I was doing. Permaculture for me has brought me to some of the most interesting, fascinating, dynamically enabled and interactive people I've met on the planet. They're not siloed usually, so they're not just one thing. And they have a sense of how do we better ourselves? How do we better the world?